the G20, which is more representative of emerging markets and developing countries, that greater representation needs to be mirrored in the institutions, particularly in the World Bank and the IMF, but also the regional development banks. What do I mean by that? I mean there needs to be some announcement, at least symbolic, at the G20 summit that the G20 countries are committed to governance reform at the IMF and World Bank. And in particular, what they could say is that in the case of the Europeans and the US, they will recognize, they do favor that the future heads of the IMF and the World Bank should be chosen under an open meritocratic process without regard to nationality. That would be, that's a symbolic but important because it locks in the concept that the G20 itself matters because of the greater representation. Now, the biggest issue in terms of urgency for developing countries is access to financial resources for trade finance, for recapitalizing their banks because of revenue shortfalls which are undermining their safety net programs. So what needs to be done is to sort of add up potential new resources that could be gotten through the IMF in the form of an SDR allocation, to suspend some of the safeguards and procurement arrangements at the World Bank and the other regional banks that delay use of the capital they have now, to suspend those safeguards for, say, 1 year, and to institute ex post monitoring to minimize abuses. I think these two things, governance and financing for developing countries, have to be very high on the agenda. I have a third issue, which is on climate change, where I think it would be useful if the G20 set a roadmap for how to deal with the monitoring, reporting, information, clearinghouse functions that any climate change agreement will be bound to require. We can't have an agreement without country-based information and some mechanism for enforcement and for clearinghouse on the trading of emissions rights. My own view is that some sort of arrangement should be made to give a place like the World Bank the mandate to set up a gigantic trust fund that would have grant money to finance these things and would have a separate governance arrangement at which China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, the major emitters in the developing world as well as in the rich world, and the major forested countries would be at the table.